Hello, folks.
Hello.
How are you?
Hi.
How are you? Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming out. I'm Rory. I'm one of the docents here at the Witch House. The Witch House does events all through the year, this being one of them tonight. So, I love ghost stories.
Yeah.
Reading ghost stories at Christmas, it's this old British and Irish tradition, and mostly goes back, very popular in the 19th century, but most historians think it goes back even further than that, but we're not quite sure. It probably does. It's a tradition that never really fully moved over to the US. People obviously do read ghost stories for Christmas, clearly, but it's always done, I think, sort of self-consciously, like this is an import, we're doing a thing that we're importing from someplace else, which is in its own way a very American kind of thing, to import traditions from elsewhere. So I picked a few ghost stories for this evening. And one nice thing about ghost stories at Christmas is that they're actually non-sectarian. Whatever you do this time of year, everyone loves a good ghost story. So they have a broad appeal. Now, most folks, when you think of ghost stories at Christmas, you immediately think of Charles Dickens. That's totally fair. Christmas Carol in prose, Ghost Story for Christmas, a classic. When I think of ghost stories for Christmas, I think of M.R. James. M.R. James is Montague Rhodes James. He was an academic at Cambridge back at the turn of the 20th century. And he would write ghost stories, and he would get his friends together at Christmas time, and he would read them the ghost stories that he wrote. And the ghost stories are great. He wrote a couple dozen of them during his life, and they're all classics. And being a kind of, repressed, withdrawn, turn of the century Englishman academic that he was, a lot of the stories have a kind of understated subtlety to them, which is really nice. And then in some of them, the last page or two, he will hit you with an image which is ghastly. And you just think, my God, Monty, what is wrong with you? But I picked one of the more subtle ones this evening. It's called the Mezzotint. And it's one of his earlier ones. First couple paragraphs of the Mezzotint, I'm going to skip because he spent some time connecting this story to an earlier story that he wrote. If you don't know that story, it makes no sense to bring this stuff up. But the important thing is in those couple of paragraphs, he introduces us to his protagonist for this story, Mr. Williams, who is a typical M.R. James kind of hero or protagonist. Mr. Williams works at an art gallery attached to a college, and it says that he confines his attention to enlarging the already unsurpassed collection of English topographical drawings and engravings possessed by his museum. Yet, as it turns out, even a department so homely and familiar as this may have its dark corners. And to one of these, Mr. Williams was unexpectedly introduced. So the Mezzotint by M.R. James. Those who have taken even the most limited interest in the acquisition of topographical pictures are aware that there is one London dealer whose aid is indispensable to their researches. Mr. J.W. Britnell publishes at short intervals a very admirable catalog of a large and constantly changing stock of engravings, plans, old sketches of mansions, churches, and towns in England and Wales. The catalogs were, of course, the ABC of his subject to Mr. Williams. Now, in February of last year, there appeared upon Mr. Williams's desk at the museum a catalog in Mr. Britnell's emporium, and accompanying it was a typewritten communication from the dealer himself. The letter ran as follows: Dear Sir, we beg to call your attention to number 978 in the accompanying catalog, which we will be glad to send on approval. Yours faithfully, J.W. Britnell. To turn to number 978 in the accompanying catalog was the work of a moment, and in the place indicated, he found the following entry. 978, unknown. Interesting Mezzotint. View of a manor house in the early part of the century, 15 by 10 inches, black frame, £2, 2 shillings. It was not especially exciting, and the price seemed high. However, as Mr. Britnell, who knew his business and his customer, seemed to set store by it, Mr. Williams wrote a postcard asking for the article to be sent on approval, along with some other engravings and sketches which appeared in the same catalog. And so he passed, without much excitement of anticipation, to the ordinary labors of the day. A parcel of any kind always arrives a day later than you expect it. It was delivered at the museum by the afternoon post of Saturday, and Mr. Williams had left work and was accordingly brought around to his rooms in college by the attendant in order that he might not have to wait over Sunday before looking through it and returning such of the contents as he did not propose to keep. And here he found it when he came into tea with a friend. The only item with which I am concerned was the rather large black-framed mezzotint, which I have already quoted the short description given in Mr. Britnell's catalogue. So more details of it will have to be given. Very nearly the exact duplicate of it may be seen in a good many old inn parlors or in the passages of undisturbed country mansions. It was a rather indifferent mezzotint, and an indifferent mezzotint is perhaps the worst form of engraving known. It presented a full-face view of a not very large manor house of the last century, with 3 rows of plain sashed windows with rusticated masonry about them, a parapet with balls or bases at the angles, and a small portico at the center. On either side there were trees, and in front a considerable expanse of lawn. The legend AWF sculpts it was engraved in the narrow margin, and there were no further inscriptions. The whole thing gave the impression that it was the work of an amateur. What in the world Mr. Britnell could mean by affixing a price of £2, 2 shillings to such an object was more than Mr. Williams could imagine. He turned it over with a good deal of contempt. Upon the back was a paper label, the left-hand side of which had been torn off. All that remained were the words, the ends of the 2 lines of writing. The first had the letters Ingley Hall, the second SSEX. It would perhaps just be worthwhile to identify the place represented, which you could easily do with the help of a gazetteer. And then he would send it back to Mr. Britnell with some remarks reflecting upon the judgment of that gentleman. He lighted the candles, for it was now dark, made the tea, and supplied the friend who had been playing golf, for I believe the authorities of the university which I write indulge in that pursuit by way of relaxation. And tea was taken to the accompaniment of a discussion which golfing persons can imagine for themselves, but which the conscientious writer has no right to inflict upon non-golfing persons. He hates golf. It was now that the friend, let us call him Professor Binks, took up the framed engraving and said, "What is this place, Williams?" "Just what I'm trying to find out," said Williams, going to the shelf for a gazetteer. "Look at the back, Somethingly Hall, either Sussex or Essex, half the name's gone, you see. You don't happen to know it, do you?" "It's from that man Britnell, I suppose, isn't it?" said Binks. "It's for the museum?" "Well, I think I should buy it if the price was 5 shillings, said Williams. "But for some unearthly reasons, he wants 2 guineas for it. I can't conceive why. It's a wretched engraving, and there aren't even any figures to give it life." "It's not worth 2 guineas, I should think," said Binks. "But I don't think it's so badly done. The moonlight seems rather good to me. I should have thought there were figures, or at least a figure, just on the edge in front." "Let's look," said Williams. "Well, it's true the light is rather cleverly given. Where's your figure?" "Oh, yes, just the head, the very front of the picture." And indeed there was, hardly more than a black blot in the extreme edge of the engraving, the head of a man or a woman, a good deal muffled up, the back turned to the spectator and looking towards the house. Williams had not noticed it before. "Still," he said, "it was a cleverer thing than I thought. I can't spend museum money on a picture of a place I don't know." Professor Binks had his work to do and soon went. And very nearly up to hall time, Williams was engaged in a vain attempt to identify the subject of his picture. If the vowel before the NG had only been left, it would have been easy enough, he thought, but as it is, the name may be anything from Guestingly to Langley. There are no names, there are more names ending like this than I thought. This rotten book has no index of terminations. Hall in Mr. Williams's college was at 7. It need not be dwelt upon. The less so as he met their colleagues who had been playing golf during the afternoon, and words which have no concern to us were freely bandied across the table, merely golfing words, I would hasten to explain. I suppose an hour or more had been spent in what is called common room after dinner. Later in the evening, some few retired to Williams's room. I have little doubt that whist was played and tobacco smoked. During a lull in these operations, Williams picked up the mezzotint from the table without looking at it and handed it to a person mildly interested in art, telling him where it had come from and the other particulars which we already know. The gentleman looked at it carelessly, looked at it, and then said in a tone of some interest, "It really is a very good piece of work, Williams. It's quite the feeling of the Romantic period. The light is admirably managed, and it seems to me the figure, though it's rather too grotesque, it's somehow very impressive." Yes, isn't it? Said Williams, who was just then busy giving whiskey and soda to the others in the company and was unable to come across the room and view it again. It was by this time rather late in the evening, and the visitors were on the move. As they went, Williams was obliged to write a letter or two and clear up some odd bits of work. At last, sometime past midnight, he was disposed to turn in. He put out his lamp after lighting his bedroom candle. The picture lay face upwards on the table where the last man who looked at it had put it, and it caught his eye as he turned the lamp down. What he saw made him very nearly drop the candle on the floor. And he declares now that if he had been left in the dark at that moment, he would have had a fit. And as that did not happen, I was able to put down the light on the table and take a good look at the picture. It was indubitable, frankly impossible, no doubt, but absolutely certain. In the middle of the lawn of the unknown house, there was a figure where no figure had been at 5 o'clock that afternoon. It was crawling on all fours toward the house. It was muffled in strange black garments with a white cross on the back. I do not know what the ideal course to pursue in a situation of this kind. I can only tell you what Mr. Williams did. He took the picture by one corner and carried it across the passage to a second set of rooms which he possessed. There he locked it up in a drawer, supported the doors of both sets of rooms, and retired to bed. But first, he read out and signed an account of the extraordinary change which the picture had undergone since it had come into his possession. Sleep visited him rather late. It was consoling to reflect that the behavior of the picture did not depend upon his own unsupported testimony. Evidently, the man who had looked at it the night before had seen something of the same kind as he had. Otherwise, he might have been tempted to think something gravely wrong was happening either to his eyes or to his mind. The possibility being fortunately precluded, 2 matters awaited him on the morrow. He must take stock of the picture very carefully and call in a witness for the purpose. He must make a determined effort to ascertain what house it was that was represented. He would, therefore, ask his neighbor Nisbet to breakfast with him and would subsequently spend the morning over the gazetteer. Nisbet was disengaged and arrived about 9:30. During breakfast, nothing was said about the mezzotinto by Williams, save that he had a picture on which he wished Nisbet's opinion. The morning pipe was at last lighted. The moment arrived for which he had looked. With very considerable, almost tremulous excitement, he ran across, unlocked the drawer, and extracted the picture, still face downwards, ran back and put it into Nisbet's hands. Now, he said to Nisbet, I want you to tell me exactly what you see in that picture. Describe it, if you don't mind, rather minutely. I'll tell you why I ask this. Well, said Nisbet, I have here a view of a country house, English, I presume, by the moonlight. Moonlight, you're sure of that? Certainly, the moon appears to be on the wane, if you wish for details, and there are clouds in the sky. All right, go on. I'll swear, added Williams, in an aside, there was no moon when I first saw it. Well, there's not much more to be said, Nisbet continued. The house has 1, 2, 3 rows of windows, 5 in each row, except at the bottom, where there's a porch instead of the middle one. But what about figures? Said Williams, with marked interest. There aren't any, said Nisbet. But what? No figure on the grass in front? Not a thing. You'll swear to that. Certainly I will. But there's just one other thing. What? Well, one of the windows on the ground floor, left of the door, is open. Is it really so? Oh my goodness, he must have got in, said Williams, with great excitement. And he hurried back to the sofa on which Nisbet was sitting, and catching the picture from him, verified the matter himself. It was quite true. There was no figure, and there was the open window. Williams, after a moment of speechless surprise, went to the writing table and scribbled for a short time. He brought 2 papers to Nisbet and asked him to first sign one, it was his own description of the picture, which you have just heard, and then to read the other, which was Williams' statement written the night before. What can it all mean? Said Nisbet. Exactly, said Williams. Well, one thing I must do, 3 things now that I think of it. I must find out from Garwood, this was last night's visitor, what he saw, and then I must get the thing photographed before it goes further, and I must find out where this place is. I can do the photographing myself, said Nisbet. I will, but you know, it looks very much as if we were assisting at the working out of a tragedy somewhere. The question is, has it happened already, or is it going to come off? Now, you must find where this place is. Yes, he said, looking at the picture again. I expect you're right. He's got in. If I don't make a mistake, there'll be devil to pay in some upstairs room. I'll tell you what, said Williams. I'll take the picture across to old Green, which was the senior fellow of the college, who'd been bursar for many years. It's quite likely he'll know it. We have property in Essex and Sussex. He must have been over those two counties a lot in his time. Quite likely he will, said Nisbet. But just let me take my photograph first. But look here, I rather think Green isn't up today. He wasn't in Hall last night, and I think I heard him say he was going down for the Sunday. That's true too, said Williams. I know he's gone to Brighton. Well, if you photograph it now, I'll go across to Garwood and get his statement. If you keep an eye on it while I'm gone. I'm beginning to think 2 guineas is not a very exorbitant price for it now. In a short time, he had returned and brought Mr. Garwood with him. Garwood's statement was the effect that the figure, when he had seen it, was clear to the edge of the picture and had not gone far across the lawn. He remembered a white mark on the back of his drapery, but could not have been sure it was a cross. A document to this effect was then drawn up and signed, and Nisbet proceeded to photograph the picture. Now what do you mean to do? He said. Are you going to sit and watch it all day? Well, no, I think not, said Williams. I'd rather imagine we're meant to see the whole thing. You see, between the time I saw it last night and this morning, it was time for lots of things to happen. But if the creature only got into the house, it could have moved out of the house. It could easily have gone through its business in the time and gone to its own place again. But the fact of the window being open, I think, must mean that it's in there now. So I feel quite easy about leaving it. And besides, I have a kind of idea that it wouldn't change much, if at all, in the daytime. We might go out for a walk this afternoon and come in to tea or whenever it gets dark. I should leave it on the table here and support the door. My skip can get in, but no one else. The three agreed that this would be a good plan. And further, if they spent the afternoon together, they'd be less likely to talk about the business to other people. For any rumor of such transaction was going on would bring the whole phantasmalogical society about their ears. We may give them a respite until 5 o'clock. At or near the hour, the three were entering Williams's staircase. They were at first slightly annoyed to see that the door of his room was unsported and open. But in a moment, it was remembered that on Sunday, the skips came in for orders an hour or so earlier than on weekdays. However, a surprise was awaiting them. The first thing they saw was the picture leaning up against a pile of books on the table as it had been left. And the next thing was Williams's skip, seated on a chair opposite, gazing at it with undisguised horror. How was this? Mr. Filcher, the name is not my own invention, was a servant of considerable standing and set the standard of etiquette for all his own college and several other neighboring ones. And nothing could be more alien to his practice than to be found sitting in his master's chair or appearing to take any particular notice of his master's furniture or pictures. Indeed, he seemed to feel this himself. He started violently when the three men were in the room and got up with a marked effort. Then he said, I ask your pardon, sir, for taking such a freedom to step down. Not at all, Robert, said Mr. Williams. I was meaning to ask you for some time what you thought of that picture. Well, sir, I of course don't set my opinion up against yours. It ain't like any other picture I should hang when my little girl would see it, sir. Wouldn't you, Robert? Why not? Well, no, sir, the poor child, I recollect, she once saw a door Bible with pictures not half what that is. We had to sit up with her 3 or 4 nights afterwards, if you'll believe me. And if she caught sight of that skeleton there, or whatever it is, carrying off the poor baby, she'd be in a taking. You know how it is with children, how nervous they get with the little thing and all, but that's what I should say. It don't seem a right picture to be laying about, sir, not where anyone that's liable to be startled could come onto it. You should be wanting anything this evening, sir? No? Thank you. With these words, the excellent man went to continue his round of the masters, and you may be sure the gentleman whom he left, lost no time gathering around the engraver. There was the house, as before, under the waning moon and the drifting clouds. The window that had been open was shut. The figure was once more on the lawn, but not this time crawling curiously on hands and knees. Now it was erect and stepping swiftly with long strides toward the front of the picture. The moon was behind it, the black drapery hung down over its face, so that only hints of that could be seen. And what was visible made the spectators profoundly thankful they could not see more than a white dome-like forehead and a few straggling hairs. The head was bent down, the arms were tightly clasped over an object which could be dimly seen and identified as a child. Whether dead or living, it was not possible to say. The legs of the appearance alone could be plainly discerned, and they were horribly thin. From 5 to 7, the three companions sat and watched the picture by turns, but it never changed. They agreed at last it would be safe to leave it. They would return to the hall and await further developments. When they assembled again, at the earliest possible moment, the engraving was there, but the figure was gone, and the house was quiet under the moonbeams. There was nothing for it but to spend the evening over gazetteers and guidebooks. Williams was the lucky one at last, and perhaps he deserved it. At 11:30, he read from Murray's Guide to Essex the following lines: 16.5 miles, Anningly. The church has been an interesting building of Norman date, but was extensively classicized in the last century. It contains the tomb of a family of Francis, whose mansion, Anningly Hall, a solid Queen Anne house, stands immediately beyond the churchyard in a park of about 80 acres. The family is now extinct, the last heir having disappeared mysteriously in infancy in the year 1802. The father, Mr. Arthur Francis, was locally known as a talented amateur engraver in mezzotints. After his son's disappearing, he lived in complete retirement at the hall, and was found dead in his studio on the 3rd anniversary of the disaster, having just completed an engraving of the house, impressions of which are of considerable rarity. This looked like business. Indeed, Mr. Green, the bursar, on his return, at once identified the house as Anningly Hall. Is there any kind of explanation of this figure, Green? Was the question which Williams naturally asked. I don't know, I'm sure, Williams. What used to be said in the place when I first knew it, was before I came here, was just this. Old Francis was always very much down on these poaching fellows. Whenever he got a chance, he used to get a man who was suspected of it, poaching, turned off the estates. And by degrees, he got rid of all of them but one. Squires could do a lot of things they daren't even think of now. Well, this man that was left was what you find pretty often in that country, the last remains of a very old family. I believe they were lords of the manor at one time. I recollect the same thing in my own parish. What, like the man in Test of the D'Urbervilles, Williams put it. Yes, I dare say, it's not a book I could ever read myself. But this fellow, Poacher, could show a row of tombs in a church that belonged to his ancestors, and that all went to sour on him a bit. But Francis, they said, could never get at it. He always kept just on the right side of the law, until one night the keepers found him at it in the wood right at the end of the estate. You can imagine there was a row. And this man, Gaudy, that was the name to be sure, Gaudy, I thought I'd remember it, Gaudy. I was just unlucky enough, poor chap, to shoot a keeper. That was all Francis wanted. And grand juries, you know what they would have been then. And poor Gaudy was strung up double quick time. I've been shown the place he was buried in on the north side of the church. You know the way in that part of the world. Anyone that's been hanged or made away with themselves, they bury them on that side. And the idea is that there was some friend of Gaudy's, not a relation, because he had none, poor devil. He was the last of his line, kind of a space ultimate gentis. He must have planned to get hold of Francis's boy and put an end to his line too. I don't know. It's rather an out-of-the-way thing for an Essex poacher to think of, but you know, I should say now, it looks more like as if old Gaudy had managed it himself. Who? I hate to think of it. Have some whiskey, Williams. I'm going to add, the picture is now in the Ashleigh Museum. It has been treated with a view to discovering whether sympathetic ink has been used, but without effect, that Mr. Britnell knew nothing of it, save that he was sure it was uncommon, and that, though carefully watched, it has never been known to change again. The mezzotints of M.R. James. So, yeah. He writes a bunch of ghost stories which reads at Christmas, and as far as I can tell, none of them are actually set at Christmas. So if you're going to talk about spooky Christmas stuff, you should look no further than Krampus, right? Now Krampus, we all know, Krampus has kind of had his ups and downs in Germany. In the last 10 or 15 years, Krampus has gotten very popular over here in the US. So I thought I should look around for a story about Krampus. You know, that seems like a great stop for spooky Christmas stuff. So I called my friend Jen Russell. Jen is a dear friend. She's an artist, she's a librarian, and fairy tales and mythology, very much her thing. She's my go-to for these kind of questions. So I gave her a call, and we talked about Krampus for a while. I asked her, you know, are there any stories where Krampus appears as a character? Like, we know the concept, but are there stories, are there narratives that use Krampus as a figure? So we talked back and forth for a bit, and here's a short one. It's just called Krampus Night. Many years ago in Styria, A family named Strauss lived at the end of a narrow, crooked lane in a village nestled in the valley. Stefan Strauss and his wife Greta had a son, who they called Little Stefan, and he was just young enough to believe in fairy tales and just old enough to be frightened by them. Little Stefan, said his father, your room is a mess. It is always a mess. I'm sorry, Papa. I've already told you to clean your room once, and then to sweep the kitchen. But you have not cleaned your room, and you have not swept the kitchen. And what did you do when you were supposed to be doing those things? I went sledding, Little Stefan admitted. And why did you do that? Little Stefan looked down at the dusty floor he should have swept an hour ago. It felt like a long time before he told his father what he wanted to hear. Because I am bad. Big Stefan smiled. And I told you what happens to bad little boys, haven't I? Yes, Papa. And what happens to them? Krampus comes and gets them on Krampus night. Big Stefan smiled some more. What does he do with them? He hits them with birch branches, throws them into a sack, and takes them away. And you don't want that to happen, now do you? Stefan, Greta said, stop it. He has to learn. I don't want Krampus to take me away on Krampus night. And when is Krampus night? Tomorrow. Well then, you better clean your room, sweep the kitchen and the front hall too. There'll be no more sledding. Ever? We'll see what happens after tomorrow night, Big Stefan said seriously. Why do you do this to him? Greta asked once their son had gone up to his room. He has to learn. My father used the Krampus story to keep me in line, and I turned out all right, didn't I? Little Stefan woke early the next morning. It was bright and cold, and fresh snow had fallen, and frost spread out across the window panes. He lay in bed with the covers up to his nose. His room looked clean. He'd been up late putting things in order. It looked organized, and everything was where it should be. Every pair of socks, every tin soldier, every school book was in its place, and the whole room looked like a picture. But he was still worried he'd forgotten something. They had missed something, and a stray pencil or a lost button would be all it took for Krampus to thrash him with birch branches and toss him into his sack with all the other bad children. He tried not to be one of the bad children. He tried his best in school. He tried to honor his father and mother, but always seemed to come up short. And Big Stefan was quick to point out where he had failed, where he could do better next time. He tried to be good, but chores were boring, and sledding was so much more fun. Little Stefan tiptoed out of his bed and over to the window to look out over the snowy, crooked little lane. Children from all the other houses were out having snowball fights or building snow forts, laughing and yelling, and their breath made little clouds in the brittle air. Some of them had skates under their arms, and others were pulling sleds behind them as they headed out to the rolling hills and the frozen ponds at the edge of the village. He got dressed, put on his wool socks and his long trousers. It would always take a couple of minutes to sweep the kitchen and the front hall, and then he could go sledding. He'd be gone for an hour, maybe just a little more, because chores were boring and sledding was fun. Surely, Big Stefan and Krampus couldn't blame him for having a little fun once everything was done. Little Stefan, his father said later when he got home, where have you been? Nowhere, Papa. Nonsense, where have you been? I went sledding. I did everything you wanted, and then I went sledding. Did I say you could? No. Did you even ask me? No. No, you did not. He did his chores first, Greta said. He did what you wanted. He did everything halfway. Have you seen the front hall? Big Stefan turned back to his son. And you know what tonight is. Krampus night, Little Stefan whispered. Speak up. Krampus night. Tonight is Krampus night. Sweep the front hall and go to your room. And hope you don't end up at the bottom of his sack at midnight. It was dark outside, and Little Stefan could see a sliver of the moon up in the icy sky. His room, his neat and tidy room with not a pin out of place, was silver and white and still. He couldn't sleep. He didn't want to end up in Krampus' sack. He didn't know what happened to little boys and girls Krampus took. He just knew he took them away and they were never heard from again. He knew he didn't want to find out. If Krampus came for him, he could hide. He could hide in his closet behind his big coat and his Sunday best, or under the bed, where summer clothes were packed in big boxes, and there might be just enough room for him to hide until Krampus gave up looking. You heard a sound outside, a movement, breathing. You heard the jingle of bells, and pulled the covers up over his head. Down the hall, Big Stefan rolled over, half asleep. Schnapps always made him drowsy. He reached over to Greta, fingers fumbling in the dark. She was all the way on the other side of the bed, far away from him. So he rolled back over the other way, burped, and tried to go back to sleep. The bedroom door opened slowly, old hinges creaking like a haunted house. He heard footsteps. The boy was probably going to ask to sleep with them tonight. Maybe he'd gone too far with all the Krampus talk. Maybe he'd put a real scare into little Stefan. Too much of a scare. But no, of course not, he thought now. My father scared me with Krampus stories, and I turned out all right. Footsteps coming across the floor. They weren't little Stefan's. They were too heavy, and they sounded wrong, lopsided. Big Stefan sat up groggily and struck a match to light the lamp. Krampus loomed up at the end of the bed. His one cloven hoof and one human foot made strange lopsided footfalls as he came closer. The demon's spur was shaggy and black and glittered with snowflakes and ice. His horns scraped the ceiling. His nasty pointed tongue flicked out from between his fangs. The bells strung along the chains he wore were anything but merry. Big Stefan couldn't move. What is it? Greta murmured, deep in her sleep, but her husband couldn't answer. Big Stefan saw little Stefan peek out from behind the demon and smile. It's Krampus night, Papa. Krampus brought the branch down on Big Stefan's head and then jabbed him with it hard in the center of his chest. You, the demon said in an ancient voice, get in the sack.
Wow.
So Jen and I talked for a bit about Krampus. I said, are there any Krampus stories? And she said, no. The Brothers Grimm sort of mention Krampus in passing, but there are no actual tales, folk stories about Krampus that have gotten handed down. So I was forced to write one myself.
Wow, that's amazing.
This is a poem by a poet named Leah Bodine Drake, who nobody but me remembers. She's a folklorist from the 1940s and 50s, and she published a small book with Arkham House. It was called A Horn Book for Witches. And this is a true tale of Squantum Town. It's subtitled. It's called The Ballad of the Jabberwock. And one of the critics at the time said that she writes conventional poetry about unconventional things. My grandmother tells me, when the lights are low, how the Jabberwock appeared in Squantum long ago. First, a frightened farmer tearing into town told how his wife had seen something big and brown, horned like a billy goat and scaled like a dragon, perched cross-legged on their brand new wagon. It leapt into the barn and hid in the hay. She screeched blue murder and fainted away. The timberman saw it, coming from Cross Keys. It crept from Corkery's wood and peered round the trees. Footprints were found in fields, clawed like a bird's. It clumped over Karsh's roof, gibbering words. Then folks began to see it, here and everywhere, clinging to the steeple, winging through the air. The bands of a mighty bat are walking in a pasture, upright as any man and cocky as a master. Squantum locked all its doors, and bright lamps were lit in chilly front parlors where folks seldom sit, except for a funeral or the minister's call. But what lurks in darkness, they lighted up all. Some few were skeptical and would only smile, but the path to the barn at night seemed like a mile. Reverend Wolsey preached of sin, and most folks agreed. This was a warning they had better heed. They named it the Jabberwock, for want of another, but some shook their heads. It's the devil's own brother. Then people came to church, who'd never been yet. Some patched up a quarrel, some paid a debt. Cousin Flo and Cousin Kate forgot they didn't speak. And Old Man Jones stayed sober for one amazing week. Wives left off nagging and husbands kissed their wives. The Cladwell brothers went to work for once in their lives. No one watered any milk or cut the measures down, until he got religion and all her girls left town. Then one day the town awoke to find it had fled. No one saw it squatting on his barn or shed. No one saw those footprints huge upon the lawn. Suddenly as it had come, the Jabberwock had gone. The church held a meeting, and great thanks were given, that Satan had done his worst and left them scared and shriven. Satan had ramped about, roaring like a lion, with Squankum held firm, and now was a little Zion. They were the wonder town of the countryside. They had driven evil out and let good abide. For almost a fortnight, then someone stole a sack of flour out of Barker's store, until these girls came back. Wakefield. Well, thank heavens that yokel seemed to know the place, Mr. Court said to himself. First to the right, second to the left, black gates. Hope the elfin Wendover, who sent me 6 miles out of my way, will freeze to death. It's not often like this in England. Cold as a penny in a dead man's eye. He barely reached the place before dusk. To let the car out of the rasping, frozen roads. First to the right, must be this. Second to the left, must be this. There were the black gates. He got out, swung them open, and drove cautiously up a narrow, twisting drive, his headlights peering suspiciously around the bends. Those hedges wanted clipping, he thought, and the lane would have to be remetalled, full of holes. Nasty drive on a bad night would cost some money, though. The car began to climb steeply and swing to the right, and presently the high hedges ended abruptly, and Mr. Court pulled up in front of Lorne Manor. He got out of the car, rubbed his hands, stamped his feet, and looked about him. Lorne Manor was embedded halfway up a Chiltern spur, and as the agent had observed, commanded extensive vistas. The place looked its age, Mr. Court decided, or rather ages, for the double Georgian brick chimneys warred with the Queen Anne left front. You could just make out the date, 1703, the base of the nearest chimney. All that wing must have been added later. Big place, marvelous bargain, 7,000, can't understand it. How those windows with their little curved eyebrows seemed to frown down on one. Then he turned and examined the vistas. The trees were tinted exquisitely to an uncertain glory as the great red sinking sun flashed its rays on their crystal mantle. The Vale of Aylesbury was drowsing beneath a slowly deepening shroud of mist. Above it, the hills, their crests rounded and shaded by silver and rose coppices, seemed to have in them great smoky eyes of flame, where the last rays burned in them. It's like some dream world, thought Mr. Court. It's curious how, whenever the sun strikes, it seems to make an eye, each one fixed on me. Those hills, even the windows, but judging from that mist, a slow journey home. I better have a quick look inside, though I've already taken a prejudice against this place. I hardly know why. Too lonely and isolated, perhaps. Then the eyes blinked and closed, and it was dark. He took a key from his pocket and went up 3 steps and thrust it into the keyhole of the massive oak door. The next moment, he looked forward into absolute blackness. The door swung to and closed behind him. This, of course, must be the palatial paneled hall which the agent had described. He must strike a match and find the light switch. He fumbled in his pockets without success, and he went through them again. He thought for a moment, I must have left them on the seat of the car, he decided. I'll go and fetch them. The door must be just behind me here. He turned and groped his way back, and then drew himself up sharply, for it seemed that something had slipped past him. And he put out his hands to touch the back of a chair, brocaded, he judged. He moved to the left and walked into a wall. Changed his direction, went back past the chair, and found the wall again. Went back to the chair, sat down, went through his pockets again, more thoroughly and carefully this time. Well, there's nothing to get fussed about. He was bound to find the door sooner or later. Now, let him think. When he came in, he'd gone straight forward, 3 yards perhaps. He couldn't have gone straight back because he'd stumbled into the chair. So the door must be a little to the left or the right of it. He tried each in turn. He turned to the left first and found himself going down a narrow little passage. You could feel its sides when he stretched out his hands. Well then, he tried the right. He did so and walked into a wall. He groped his way along it, and again, it seemed as if something slipped past him. I wonder if there's not a bat in here, he asked himself, and then found himself back at the chair. How Rachel would laugh, you could see him now. Surely he had a stray match somewhere. He took off his overcoat and ran his hands around the seam of every pocket, and then did the same to the coat and waistcoat of his suit. He put them on again. Why, he tried again. He followed the wall along. He did so, and found himself in a narrow passage. Suddenly he shot out his right hand, for he had the impression that something had brushed his face very lightly. I'm beginning to get a little bored with that bat, and this blazed room generally, he said to himself. I can imagine a more nervous person than myself, getting a little fussed and panicky. But that's not the one thing not to do. And here was that chair again. Now, I'll try the wall on the other side. Well, that seemed to go on forever. And he retraced the steps until he found the chair and sat down again. He whistled a little snatch resignedly. Is that an echo? The little tune had been flung back at him so fiercely, almost menacingly. Menacingly. That was just the feeble, panicky word a nervous person would use. Well, he go again to the left this time. As he got up, a quick spurt of cold air fanned his face. Is anyone there? He said. He had purposely not raised his voice. There was no need to shout. Of course, no one answered. How could there have been an answer, since the caretaker was away? Now, let him think it out. When he came in, he must have gone straight forward and then swerved slightly on his way back. Therefore, no, he was getting confused. At that moment, he heard the whistle of a train and felt reassured. The line from Wendover to Aylesbury ran half left from the front door, so it should be about there. He pointed with his finger, got up, groping his way forward, and found himself in a narrow little passage. Well, he must turn back and go to the right this time. He did so, and something seemed to slip just past him. He scratched his finger slightly on the brocade of the chair. Talk about a maze, he thought to himself. It's nothing to this. And then he said to himself, under his breath, curse this vile, godforsaken place. A silly, panicky thing to do, he realized, almost as bad as shouting aloud. Well, there's obviously no use trying to find the door. He couldn't find it, couldn't. He'd sit in the chair till the light came. He sat down. How very silent it was. His hands began searching his pockets once more. Except that sort of whispering sound over the left somewhere. Except for that, he's absolutely silent. Except for that. What could it be? The caretaker was away. He turned his head slightly and listened intently. It was almost as if there were several people whispering together. One about curious sounds in old houses. How absurd it was. Then it couldn't be more than 3 or 4 yards from the door. There was no doubt about that. It must be slightly to one side or the other. He tried the left once more. He got up, and something lightly brushed his face. Is anyone there? He said. And this time, he knew he had shouted. Who touched me? Who's whispering? Where's the door? What a nervous fool he was to shout like that. Yet someone outside might have heard him. He went groping forward again and touched a wall. He followed along, touching with his fingertips, and there was an opening. The door, it must be. He found himself going down a little narrow passage. He turned again and ran back. Then he remembered. He put a match booklet in his note case. What a fool to have forgotten it. He made such an exhibition of himself. Yes, there it was. His hands were trembling, and the booklet slipped through his fingers. He fell to his knees and began searching about the floor. It must be just here, it can't be far. And then something icy cold and damp was pressed against his forehead. He flung himself forward to seize it, but there was nothing there. And then he leapt to his feet, with tears streaming down his face, cried, Who's there? Save me! Save me! Then he began to run round and round with his arms outstretched. And at last he stumbled against something, the chair, and something touched him as it slipped past. And then he ran screaming around the room, and suddenly the scream slashed back at him, for he was in a narrow little passage. Now, Mr. Runt, said the coroner, you say you heard screaming coming from the direction of the manor. Why didn't you go find out what was the matter? None of us chaps goes to the manor after sundown, said Mr. Runt. I know there's some absurd superstition about the house, but you haven't answered the question. There were screams, obviously coming from someone who wanted help. Why didn't you go see what was the matter instead of running away? None of us chaps go to the manor after sundown, said Mr. Burns. Don't fence the question. Let me remind you, the doctor said Mr. Court must have had a seizure of some kind, but that had help been quickly forthcoming, his life might have been saved. Do you mean to tell me, even if you had known this, you still would have acted in so cowardly a way? Mr. Runt fixed his eyes on the ground and fingered his cap. None of us chaps goes to the manor after sunset. Don't know if it's perfect, but it's good. I'm going to round off with another poem called The Ballad of the Harp Weaver. It's by Edna St. Vincent Millay, a well-known American poet. And it's from a collection of her poems that won the Pulitzer back in the 40s. Son, said my mother, when I was knee-high, you've need of clothes to cover you, and not a rag have I. There's nothing in the house to make a boy breeches, nor shears to cut cloth with, nor thread to take stitches. There's nothing in the house but a loaf end of rye, and a harp with a woman's head nobody will buy. And she began to cry. That was in the early fall. When came the late fall, son, she said, the sight of you makes your mother's blood crawl. Little skinny shoulder blades sticking through your clothes, and where you'll get a jacket from, God above knows. It's lucky for me, lad, your daddy's in the ground. You can't see the way I let his son go around. And she made a queer sound. That was in the late fall. When winter came, I had not a pair of breeches nor a shirt to my name. I couldn't go to school or out of doors to play, and all the other little boys passed our way. Son, said my mother, come climb into my lap and I'll chafe your little bones while you take a little nap. I know that we were silly for half an hour or more, me with my long legs dragging on the floor. Rocking to a Mother Goose rhyme. Oh, but we were happy for half an hour's time. There I was, a great boy. What would folks say to hear my mother singing me to sleep all day in such a daft way? Men say the winter was bad that year. Fuel was scarce, and food was dear. The wind with a wolf's head howled about our door. We burned up the chairs and sat on the floor. All that was left us was a chair we couldn't break, and the harp with a woman's head nobody would take for song or pity's sake. The night before Christmas, I cried with the cold. I cried myself to sleep like a 2-year-old. In the deep night, I felt my mother rise, stared down upon me with love in her eyes. I saw my mother sitting on the one good chair, light falling on her from I couldn't tell where. Looking 19, not a day older, and the harp with a woman's head leaned against her shoulder. Her thin fingers moving, and the thin, tall strings were weaving wonderful things. Many bright threads from where I couldn't see were running through the harp strings rapidly. The gold threads whistling through my mother's hand, I saw the web grow and the pattern expand. She wove a child's jacket, and when it was done, she laid it on the floor and wove another one. She wove a red cloak so regal my size. That's all I brought for you this evening. Thank you all so much for coming out on Friday the 13th here at the Witch House. There are always cool things happening here at the Witch House, so go to the website, check other events that we do here, and you're always welcome. So thank you all for coming out, and happy Merry whatever you do this time of year, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
How do you like your story? The one you wrote?
Oh, thank you. That's very sweet.
The kind of really, really good.
Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. I need to read like you. Wow, never heard that one.